welcome to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Kathy Group. I'm the Advertising and Marketing Manager for HGA, and I get to be your host today. We will have questions today. They'll be the last 15 minutes of the program. So please put your questions in the Q&A and don't use the chat. They get lost there, so we can never find those. We are sponsored today by Marcy Petrini and Terry Dwyer. I want to thank both of them for sponsoring Textiles and Tea today. Today we have Tien Chiu as our guest. Tien is an expert on color and weaving. Her work has been exhibited in museums and featured on the cover of Handwoven. And she's written articles for Shuttle Spindle and Die Pot. She has taught over 10,000 students on her online classes. She's woven hundreds of handwoven fabric swatches, and she's dyed over 2,500 yarn samples in a quest to understand color. She teaches about color and weaving on her website, warpandweave.com. Welcome, Tien.
Hi, Kathy.
It's good to have you here today.
It's good to be on.
Great. Our first questions, most important, of course, is what kind of tea do you like?
I have it right here. My favorite kind of tea is actually a twist on an old favorite. It's Earl Grey tea made with fresh bergamot, freshly grated bergamot peel, which you can't get unless you have a bergamot tree in your front yard, which I do. And the story on that is a long story. I used to do a chocolates fundraiser. Once a year, I would make 120 pounds of chocolates, and I would do a chocolates fundraiser called Chocolates for Charity. And over the years, I raised, oh gosh, it must have been at least $40,000. I think I calculated it once, and it was at least $40,000 for various charities along the way. And I made over a ton of bonbons over the 30 years I was chocolatiering. And I used to make candied bergamot peel, and I got so tired of having to find a source for fresh bergamot peel that I actually planted my own tree. And then I retired from chocolatiering, but I still have the bergamot tree.
Well, now I have to look up bergamot. I've never heard of that, so that'll be on my list.
It's a citrus fruit, but it's an obscure citrus that nobody grows except me. So.
You don't do anything small, do you, Tien? You always go big.
You know, anything worth doing is worth overdoing.
Well, let's start with, how did you get into weaving and fiber art?
You know, my mom taught me fiber arts from an early age. She wasn't a weaver or a spinner or a dyer, but she did sew. So she sewed all of our clothes. And I was actually sewing my own clothes by the time I was in 5th grade. None of the other 5th graders would believe that I was actually sewing my own clothes. But she taught me how to do it. And she taught me quilting and embroidery and all sorts of other crafts. She was painting on t-shirts and doing Chinese macrame and things like that. And so I grew up with it. And then when I was in college, a friend of a friend's mom taught me how to knit. And then you'll laugh, I learned how to spin when I was playing Guinevere's Handmaiden in a college production of Camelot. And this was Caltech, so this was probably like the worst production of Camelot that was ever made, because they took everybody who was in there, and you've got a bunch of like engineering students who are doing a musical in their spare time, so nobody could sing. But we had fun, and I learned how to spin. So
again, you go big. You can't just sit there and fake it. You have to learn how to do it and do it right.
But so that's how I got into fiber arts. And then weaving, I had learned how to spin and how to knit. And then I spun and knit a ring shawl of my own design. And I felt like I had conquered all the hills that there were to conquer, or that I wanted to conquer, in spinning and knitting. And I was looking for something else to do. And Nancy Tepes, who I call my weaving mom, said, why don't you try weaving? It's the most intellectually interesting of all the fiber arts. And I said, really? And I bought an 8-shaft baby wolf, and I dove into it, and I just fell in love. So.
Well, I have a question. You brought up your parents. So
yes,
your parents were an astrophysicist and a biochemist, right? And I got that right?
That's
right. And you studied math, right?
That's right.
So how do the math and sciences impact on your fiber arts?
I think of myself as an art scientist. I don't have I didn't start with any art background at all. And so when I got into design, I had to figure out everything from scratch. And so I kind of went at it from a scientist's perspective and said, okay, this isn't working. Let's do an experiment. Let's come up with a theory for why this isn't working. Uh, and let's do an experiment to find out why it is working. You know, what might make it work. And so I approached everything from that perspective. And it actually turned out to be very powerful because then when I came to something where seemingly nobody knew why it worked. So when I came to color and weaving, and I went looking for a reference that would tell me how it worked, and I didn't find anything because there aren't any books on color in weaving that really put together weave structure and color and all of that and put it all together. Then I just looked at it from a scientist's point of view and said, okay, let's collect a whole bunch of data, pull it together, analyze it, and see what happens. And so I came at it from a scientist's perspective, and I developed a whole theory about why it worked, and I read a whole bunch of information. And so come at art from a scientist's perspective, and I come at design from a scientist's perspective. And I really think that makes me a more powerful teacher and a more powerful designer, precisely because I didn't start out with sort of a traditional training. So it's really affected everything.
Well, I would imagine, I was looking at my list here of people we've had so far, I would say probably a fourth of the people I've interviewed have a science background. I'm always amazed how much science, people of science are drawn to, the fiber arts. Well, I have to ask you about the wedding dress. Everybody knows the wedding dress. And so you just burst onto the scene with this gorgeous piece of weaving. Isn't it gorgeous? Look at it. Oh, and not just the weaving, but the design of it. And then not only that, there's a great story with it. So could you talk some about this dress, how it came to you, how the idea came to you? And the other thing I want to know is, how did this change your life as an artist? Yeah, how did this change? Because it was such a big impact.
So the first thing I have to say is that it's entirely Sharon Alderman's fault. I'm holding Sharon Alderman personally responsible, not only for my
Sharon's watching. Sharon, hope you're on here.
Is she? Well, Sharon Alderman I'm holding her personally responsible, not only for my becoming an artist, but for my marriage, actually, because the story is that I went to CNCH in 2009, I think it was, and I was taking a workshop from Sharon Alderman, and it was about how to design fabric for a specific purpose. And I was trying to think of what I could possibly design that would be so complicated that I would need the help of like a weaving goddess such as Sharon Alderman. And I thought, because at that point I felt like if I was designing dish towels, I could figure that out myself. And so I said a wedding dress. I was like, at that point I think I was 38 or 39, and I said, someday I'll probably get married, maybe, hopefully to the person that I'm with. But, at some point in my life, I'll presumably get married again. And so I'm going to design samples for a wedding dress. And I came back and I designed my samples in the workshop, and I came back and I blogged about it. And I said, this is a strictly theoretical wedding dress. We are not engaged. And of course, my spouse comes back or my spouse to be comes back and says, I wouldn't actually mind being married to you. And,
oh, how romantic.
Well, engineers, right? And that was probably the least romantic proposal I could possibly imagine. But, the wedding was on. And so I made the wedding dress with help from my sewing mentor, Sharon Bell. And it was an amazing experience because I'd only been weaving for 2.5 years when I got started with it. And so I made practically every mistake you could possibly make along the way. And I got help for an amazing number of people. And The Weave Tech mailing list was incredibly useful to me, and everybody was just so kind and so helpful. And it really took a village, to put the dress together. But when I had finished it, and I spent an entire year, and about 1,000 hours making it, with help from my my sewing mentor, Sharon Bell, who was a former couture seamstress um, and also a fashion school dean.
Oh,
And I looked at it and I said, this is amazing. I could actually be an artist. And that had never thought of, I had never thought of that before because I come from, a line of scientists, and I went to Caltech, and the artists were these other people over here who did like sort of came out of the sky and did other things. And so it really changed my life. And so it was an amazing story. It really changed the course of my life.
well, I would imagine, because I remember we had an article about it in Shuttle, Spindle, and Die Pot. And I remember the thing that struck me was like that you'd only been weaving 2.5 years. And I thought, your life cannot be the same after this hit, social media and the magazines and everything. It was just huge.
It really changed my life. Nothing was the same after I had done it, because I kind of couldn't go back to seeing myself as primarily a high-tech project manager after that, because I was like, I could actually be an artist, and I couldn't quite be content as a high-tech project manager after that, because I felt like something in me was trying to get out. It was just different. And the fact that it wound up in a museum afterwards was more evidence that, maybe there was more to this art thing than I had thought there was.
Little did you know.
Little did I know, right?
Well, when weavers think of color, they think of you and your work. And we have an image of your Kodachrome jacket, which is just gorgeous. How do you think that that color became such a passion for you, rather than maybe pattern or something else?
Well, a couple of things. One, I've always liked bright colors. When I was in college, I spent 3 years running around in tie-dye and bare feet, actually. I was in the hippie house in college, insofar as Caltech has anything approximating a hippie house. But also, I was just so incredibly incompetent with color when I started out that,
Really?
yeah, if you look at my early work, I really didn't understand color mixing. I mean, my really early work, I really didn't understand color mixing. I really didn't understand how to put colors together. And I was so frustrated by that. And I was so frustrated by the lack of resources around color that I guess I just got frustrated by it. And so I decided that I was going to sit down and solve this problem once and for all. And so I spent a couple of years studying color and trying to figure out how the whole thing worked, and that's how I wound up as an expert on color.
Well, Tien,
Yeah.
I blew it. I should have gotten an early work to inspire all of us who are color challenged, that we too could be on the level of Tien. That's amazing.
It real it I make a habit actually of doing things that I'm bad at, because I feel like beginner's mind is so important. And so I wound up, I took up cycling because I'm bad at it. Cycling is for sort of tall, skinny people. If you want to be good at cycling, it helps to be, if you're going to be Lance Armstrong, you want to have really long legs and be skinny. And, I'm basically short. I'm basically short and stocky. I'm built like an ox, right? Good peasant stock. And so I took up cycling because I thought there's no way that I'll be good at it. And so it takes the pressure off, right? You can have beginner's mind and you can do it. And I wound up doing the AIDS ride, 4 times, which is bicycling from San Francisco to LA in a week, to raise money for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And I wound up, and because of course I was a slow rider, I was never, I was always in the back 2/3 of the pack. I wound up doing it in a tutu in hand sewn You know, I never quite got up to the hand woven tutu, but I always wound up doing it in hand sewn costumes. So
And
I
I
believe
don't
in
have a
doing
picture of that either. I am falling down on the job. I tell you.
the last one I ever did, I did in a hand sewn cloth of gold peacock feather tutu with 1,000 peacock feathers on it.
That's amazing.
Because anything worth doing is worth overdoing.
There you go.
So anyway.
If you had to choose, and I'm going to make you choose, would you consider yourself more of a teacher or an artist?
Well, I was actually just thinking about that, and I was going to say that the answer is mu, which is the Zen for sort of unask the question, which says that embedded in the question is a wrong assumption, and that it's sort of like, have you stopped beating your wife lately? And because when I teach because I want to explain how I do my art, and when I do my art, it's because I want to have something to teach about. Um, but I actually think that the answer is that I'm actually a researcher who likes to, and so you do the research, and then you learn how to apply the research, and then you teach what you've discovered the application for.
Wow. That
Because my
gives
parents
me,
brought me up well, right? They're scientific researchers. So you do the research, you get your results, and then you publish them.
oh, that's amazing. That's really good.
It's just that my medium happens to be art.
Right.
So, you know, I'm following in my parents' footsteps. I'm just not doing it in science.
Well, following footsteps, let me ask you this. You took a huge leap of faith, and you've talked about this some already, but and that you quit your job and became a full-time artist slash teacher. And you've talked some about this, but what gave you the faith to know it was the right thing to do and that you could do it? That's a scary thing to do.
It is, but, you know, I woke up one morning and sort of looked at the ceiling and realized that I hated my job. And I had had this particular realization before, but it had always been the company, my boss, the project. But, you know, I was working at Google on cutting edge technology, and I liked my boss just fine, which forced me to realize that the problem was actually just that I just hated my job. And so I had, you know, basically I had a choice. I could either continue on in my job and hate my job for the next 20 years, which was really going to suck, or I could go do something else. You know, and that really wasn't much of a choice. You know, I mean, I suppose I could have if I'd really been forced to it, but, you know, so I quit my job, and I was going to take a couple months off and decide what to do next. And then, unfortunately, my mother passed away
Oh,
at almost the time that I quit my job, but she left me enough money that I could, coupled with my savings, I could actually do a new start. And so I kind of looked into what I could do with this art thing, and I concluded that there was no way that I could make enough money as an artist or as a production weaver to pay my mortgage in the Bay Area, but that I might be able to do it teaching online. And so that was what I decided to do. And I worked at it for, you know, 60 hours a week for a couple of years, because the alternative was to go back to working in high tech. And nothing against the people who love working in high tech, but for me personally, I'd rather sweep streets. So I was very highly motivated. But I love my job. You know, it's a lot more work, and I get paid a lot less than when I was working at Google, but I just love every bit of it, and I love teaching. And, you know, I taught 11,000 people last year, and I taught something like 8 or 9,000 of them for free, and I still managed to pay my mortgage. And how awesome is that?
well, it's also amazing that you whether you knew it or not, you saw the future coming, which was online learning.
Mhm.
So you had gone through all the ups and downs and the how to and how to make it work before COVID hit, which is amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I had worked out a lot of the kinks in the system before COVID hit.
Right, right. Well, A lot of artists look up to you, a lot of weavers. They take your classes. They love what you teach and how you teach. And you've mentioned some folks, but who are the people who have influenced you and that you still look up to as fiber artists?
So when I was just learning how to design, two weavers really stand out. Bonnie Inoue taught me how to draft and how to design my own work, and that was very generous of her. And I owe her a lot in terms of being able to design independently. Laura Fry invited me to her place and taught me for an entire week about ergonomics and design and a whole bunch of other things about weaving, also entirely for free. She is one of the most generous weavers I have ever met, and she is just an amazing and wonderful person. And I can still hear her in my head saying, "It depends." Um, and and all sorts of other things. It's not finished until it's wet finished. There's so much of Laura's wisdom that I've just absorbed over the years. Sharon Alderman, of course, is responsible for a lot of personal advice. I think of her as one of my mentors and a friend, and of course, she's responsible for my marriage. And along with my entire artistic career. Nancy Tepes is my weaving mom. She's the one who got me into weaving to begin with. And Sharon Bell is my sewing mentor and also a good friend of mine. And so she was the brains behind the wedding dress. She taught I did the sewing, but she taught me how to sew it. And so those were probably my biggest influences.
What a wonderful village you surrounded yourself with of all these people. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Well, I hear that, changing subjects here, I hear you have two TC looms. They have names.
they do.
And we have to hear about the names, but also, why did you switch from a floor loom to a TC2?
So the TC2 is a Jacquard loom. What you're seeing now is me and David Weinschenker, who's a friend of mine who helped me put it together when it arrived. They're made in Norway. And so when she arrived on a pallet, and it required a special truck to get her here.
Wow.
A piano moving truck. The first truck they sent didn't have a lift gate that was big enough, and I got to watch her drive up and then drive away because the lift gate wouldn't take the package. Um, and so the TC2 Jacquard loom lets you have thread by thread control over every thread. And so it's not like a shaft loom where, a set of threads goes up and set of threads goes down. And so with a Jacquard loom, you can weave imagery. And that was what I originally intended, because I like weaving pictures. And as you know, it's really hard to do that on a shaft loom unless you have um, a lot of shafts. And so I had an 8 shaft baby wolf, which lasted 9 months. And then I had a 16 shaft Leclerc Diana, which lasted another maybe 9 months. Then I had a 24 shaft AVL workshop Dobby loom, and that lasted a couple years. And then I had a 40 shaft AVL, which lasted 9 months until Google bought the startup I was working for, which gave me just enough money to buy Amazing Grace, which is the loom that you see there. And all my looms are named after mathematicians, with 1 or 2 exceptions. So I feel that female mathematicians have not gotten enough recognition over the years. And so um, the 40 shaft AVL was named Emmy, after Emmy Noether, who was one of the inventors of abstract algebra. And Einstein described her as the most important woman in the history of mathematics. And certainly she was the only woman who in college she invented Noetherian rings, and those were the only things I encountered in my study of mathematics that had a woman's name on it, which struck me as amazing. And so I named my loom after her. Amazing Grace is named after um, Grace Hopper, who is one of the legends of computer science. She was a rear admiral and was for her efforts in computer science, and was also called Amazing Grace. And she's also called Amazing Grace because I thought it was an amazing grace that I actually managed to purchase her, because it was only because Google bought the startup I was working for that I actually got the money to buy her, because, you know, Jacquard looms are not cheap. And then the other TC2, which I managed to purchase used because somebody was unexpectedly selling her at a bargain price. And I happened to be the one who leaped at the keyboard and got her first, is named Mariam, after Mariam Mirzakhani, who is the first female Fields medalist. And the Fields Medal is the mathematical equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And she tragically died a year or two ago of breast cancer, very young. She was maybe 42. And then I have an 8-shaft baby wolf that is the exception. Her name is Ruth, after Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And those are my 3 looms. And so I bought the TC2s primarily because I wanted to be able to weave. I wanted the freedom of weaving anything I wanted. And so they allow me to do imagery, but beyond that, they also allow me to do much more complex weaving than I could do on a shaft loom. So for example, my piece Bipolar Prison is triple weave and has 28 or 29 different weave structures in it. And I think we'll be seeing it later on, but it's something that and it has imagery in it that I couldn't put into a regular that I couldn't have done on a shaft loom. And one of the things that's important to me in my jacquard weaving is that it not be sort of low resolution printing. A lot of people who are weaving on jacquard looms are weaving imagery, but they're weaving imagery that could be sort of a low resolution printing. It looks just like a picture, but it's woven. And so I work on making things that are more complex, that use painted warps, or that have texture. Or Bipolar Prison is woven as a triple weave piece, and so I left some of the layers unstitched, and I inserted batting between them and quilted down some areas so that it would have 3-dimensionality to it. And so I try to use my jacquard loom to create interesting 3-dimensional effects or other things that exploit the wovenness of the art. And so I try to push the boundaries of what can be woven using my jacquard looms.
Of course you would.
So
Well, let's go to that, because actually that was my next question, is that you have been very open about your struggles with your bipolar disorder. And it was the subject of this piece called Bipolar Prison. And if you want to talk more about the piece, you can. But my question was, oh, this is beautiful, is how has fiber arts played a role in your mental health?
it's played a huge role. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is a genetic disorder, and I was diagnosed with it in 2003, and I was finally actually prescribed medication for it, which actually has stabilized my um, mood since then, thankfully. But up until then, I was dealing with untreated severe bipolar disorder. And so I was dealing with a lot of mood swings and a lot of bipolar depression. And fiber arts is really what kept me sane and actually kept me alive. I had a severe bout of bipolar depression in 2002, and I was working on a piece called The Spiral Shawl, which was hand spun and hand knit. And um, it was what I called a meditation shawl. It was woven, it was knitted, in the round, and it was knitted as a spiral, and every couple rounds, I would add a new element to the piece. So there were 8 arms, and every several rounds, I would add a new motif to it. And as I got to the end, and as I went, I would always add something new. And because I wanted to know how it turned out, that was what kept me going. You know, I was curious. I wanted to know how the shawl would finish, and that was what gave me the strength to keep going until we finally managed to find a medication that stabilized my mood. But, if I hadn't actually been working on that, I'm not sure I would be here today.
Oh, that's
So,
powerful. That's powerful.
it made a tremendous difference in my life. And so Bipolar Prison was about how I felt before I was diagnosed and treated, because I felt like I was trapped in this constantly shifting chaos between being sort of hypomanic and cheerful and full of energy, and being sort of depressed and agitated, and um being sort of tormented by by the shift in mood, because I felt like I was juggling my mood all the time, and just being stuck in that. And so I wanted to sort of convey that. And so that was a way of trying to talk about that non-verbally. I've written some essays about that that are also on my personal artist's website. But so, so that's basically how it's played out.
Oh, that's wonderful that you had that for you. That's great.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about your book, Master Your Craft.
Mhm.
You're really well known for color, but yet you write this book and it's about design.
Mhm.
So why did you go that route? Why did you change lanes, as they say?
Well, actually, Master Your Craft preceded all my work on color. So it's
Oh,
actually
okay.
I shifted lanes the other direction.
Okay.
And the answer is that after I did my wedding dress, so many people asked me how I did my wedding dress. And the answer was that I had been so I hadn't been weaving for very long, but I had been a software project manager for 15 years, and my specialty was in software development process. And so I applied what I knew about the software development process to developing the wedding dress. And it turns out that the creative process that applies to craft also I is also applies to software development, as crazy as that sounds. Because software development is a creative process. It's just a creative process that involves a team of people building something that's going to be sold uh, in engineering. And so this is another case of taking the crossover of something technical into something that is usually thought of as creative. And so I thought that would be interesting to write about. And I had always wanted to write a book. And so I wrote about it, and so it wouldn't just be me writing about it. I also interviewed 22 master craftspeople, also because I always wanted to talk to a lot of craftspeople about their creative process. And so I interviewed 22 master craftspeople, and I sort of consolidated the results into Master Your Craft.
Do you foresee another book about color?
It's funny you should mention that, because I was just talking to a couple of publishers about maybe writing a
Really?
book on color and weaving. Probably not till next year, because I'm thinking I need to do another couple classes about color first. But I'm starting to think about it. Yeah.
Will you come back after you write your book and talk to us about it?
Yes.
Good. You heard it here first, folks. There may be a book in the future. Well, we have some images. Speaking of color, we have some images of your sample die sets. Not all 2,500, but we do have some. And my first question is, why did you start dyeing your yarns instead of just buying them? And do you think that now that you dye yarns and your understanding of color, do you think it impacts on how you design your pieces and your weaving now than before you knew all this about dyeing?
It definitely does impact my my weaving. And so the original reason why I dyed them wasn't actually to understand, well, it was to understand color mixing, but not in the context of teaching. It was basically because I wanted a bigger palette than I could get from buying premixed dyes, and I also didn't want to have to store 10,000 jars of dye, and I didn't want to buy 10,000 uh, cones of yarn in every possible fiber, in every possible in every possible fiber, in every possible color, because that would rapidly lead to a warehouse full of yarn. and I wasn't quite ready to open that yarn shop yet. um, so basically, I figured if I wanted to be able to dye all my own colors, I was gonna have to dye swatches. And if I was going to dye swatches, then clearly the only possible thing to do would be to dye a systematic set of swatches in every possible color because I was me. And because, I'm the sort of person who, faced with 30 different varieties of chocolate, will feel compelled to try every single one of the 30 different varieties of chocolate because that's what you do, right? And so I decided that since I wanted to get the widest possible palette, the only possible thing to do would be to dye 1,500 colors in every possible combination, except that if I did actually every possible combination of the 14 pure MX colors, that would have actually come out to something like 25,000. And that was a little too much even for me. So I cut it down to 1,500, which was not all the colors that I wanted, but seemed like a nice workable compromise. Uh, so so that's what I did. And I have another 1,500 samples that I want to do on silk, and I've actually cut out all the squares of silk that I would do, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Will the silk be
So
on cloth rather than yarn?
the silk would be on cloth rather than
Oh, okay.
yarn. Just because the friend that I had who wound all the samples onto cards isn't willing to do another 1,500. But in terms of how it's affected my work, it has a huge effect on my work, which is that I can get any color that I want. And I can get any color that I want on cotton in 10-2 or 22 or anything like that. And because I can get any color I want and I can weave any design I want on the Jacquard loom, it gives me tremendous design freedom. And so I think differently about things than I would if I were restricted to a smaller number of colors.
Mhm.
And a lot of my work, a lot of the prep work that I've done has been around getting that kind of design freedom. So that, I've put a lot of work into that. But you can see that it pays off, like in my work seasons of creativity, which was shown at the very beginning. That's the one with the leaves falling down and then turning into butterflies. That piece is done with I think 5 different painted warps and painted wefts, and with very close color control over the intermeshing of the different things. It looks like it was woven as tapestry, but it's not. It's woven with continuous wefts, but I just dyed the wefts with a lot of very close color control and, like I said, 4 different painted wefts. And I couldn't do that kind of work if I didn't actually have all those dye samples. So it gives me the opportunity to do much more complex, much deeper work.
I, t- I just cannot imagine how much knowledge is in your head. Just that much detail and nuance in the different colors. It's just amazing. Where do you keep all the data? I mean, is it all like on a computer somewhere of this much of this color and this much of that color and all that?
Well, if you were to look at the cards, each of those cards um has three lines on it. One line has there are 3 colors on that go into each of the dye samples.
Mhm.
And so each card contains specifications for the 3 different colors, how much of each color. And each of those cards goes into a binder, and I have 6 binders full of cards. But so I have those 6 binders, and then I've got a bunch more binders for the wool samples, the wool and the silk samples. So I've got a lot of binders.
Yes, you do. Well, I love your blogs, by the way. I thought they were fascinating and very varied. And one of them that really struck me was you referred to Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken.
Mhm.
And you talked about choices that you've made and how people make choices and how they impact on your life. So my question to you is, if you could go back and talk to the younger Tien about your artwork, what would you tell her?
I think the thing that limited me early on was that, it wasn't that I was lacking in brains or energy or motivation, but simply that I wasn't aware of the breadth of the world. I went you'll laugh. I went to graduate school in mathematics because it simply didn't occur to me that people didn't get PhDs. Because, well, my mom was a biochemist, my dad was an astrophysicist, my uncle was a law professor, my aunt was some sort of, like, biochemist, something or another, my uncle was an engineer at Bell Labs, and so, and everyone they knew was also in some sort of science or law or something like that, and so it just never occurred to me that you wouldn't go off and get a PhD because that was what people did. And then I went to Caltech, and everybody I knew wound up going into high tech because we all graduated into the dot com gold rush. And so I wound up in high tech because it just never occurred to me to do anything else. And so if I were to go back in time, I would, go back and tell my younger self that, there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, and to explore more things and just to, um, I visited a friend in Philadelphia once, and we were on a bus, and I just looked around the bus and said, "Wow, there are all these people in this bus, and probably none of them work in high tech." Because living in Silicon Valley, everybody works in high tech. If they don't work in high tech,
Ah,
they work in a service industry that somehow supports people working in high tech, and it's a monoculture, you know. And it's not that there aren't people who work in the arts, it's just that the entire area is so focused on high tech that it's hard to see anything else. And so I would go back and tell my younger self, "Get out of the ivory tower, get out of the bubble, go, travel the world." I spent 6 months backpacking around Southeast Asia, and it was eye-opening. So I would go back, and tell my younger self, "Get out of the bubble for a while, go do something with people who think differently. Do something else. Go hang out with artists for a while. Discover that there are artists."
oh, that's great. I love that. Well, I want to take some questions from the audience. Um, oh, this is an interesting question. This is from Janet Lee. Hi, Tien. What does your family think about your career change? She said, I'm asking as a fellow Asian.
My mother, if she were still alive, would have loved it. I'm sorry that she wasn't able to see it. My father says that you can't make a living in art. Now that I'm making a living in art, my father says, you should send money to you should send money to your to um he says you should send money to your relatives over there who could probably use money. I'm like, really? Is that all you can say? So, yeah, not too terribly supportive, but, at least he's shut up about you can't make money living as an artist.
Well, Sarah Hall wants to know what CAD software do you use with Amazing Grace, or does it come with its own?
I use Arrowweave to design for Amazing Grace. It's designed it's software that is meant for Jacquard designing specifically.
Okay. And
It is very powerful, but also very Jacquard specific. I used to use Photoshop, but Arrowweave is just much, much easier to use.
it's Arrow Weave.
Arrowweave, Arah weave.
Oh, okay. All right. Margaret McGinnis wants to know what brand of dyes do you use, both for cellulose and protein?
I use uh, Procyon MX dyes uh for so I use Procyon MX dyes for fiber reactive dyes for cotton and linen and other cellulose fibers. And for the for protein fibers, I use Lancet dyes because those are the most light fast and wash fast of all the acid dyes. You can boil Lancet dyes and they will not come off, whereas with the Jacquard and the Dharma acid dyes, some of them are incredibly light fast and wash fast, and others not so much.
Mhm.
And the work that I do, I want to make sure that it's heirloom quality, and so I use Lancet dyes. They are not quite as bright as the Jacquard or other dyes, and it is harder to get. It's harder to get really bright, really level results, but I like them better.
Janet Lee wants to know, what classes are you planning to teach?
So this year I'm teaching the stash busting scarf weave along starting April 16th. There's currently a sign up for the notifications thing. We're opening registration on April 9th. I'm teaching stash weaving success with Janet Dawson starting in June and in June, July. And then I'm going to be offering a new class on color gradients. I'm going to be doing a weave along in August, and then then I'll be teaching color gradients as a paid class in October. And then I'll be teaching Make Your Colors Sing Again in January, February of 2022.
And I believe in 2022, you will also be teaching at Convergence in July.
I will be. I will be. I'm very excited about that.
We are excited to have you. That'll be wonderful. Here we go. Margaret White wants to know, have you considered publishing your recipes for your dye color samples in the form of a book? She said, I can imagine it'll be a hot selling book. Will that be part of your color book, do you think?
It will not be part of my color book because the color book is color in weaving.
Oh.
However, I've actually already published the dye recipes. If you go to my tienchiu.com website, all my dye samples, the photos of those are published. If you go look in the menu bar, you can see the dye samples in the menu, and all the dye samples and how to get the formulas are there, along with my methodology for getting the samples. So have fun and have at it.
Now, this is an interesting question, and there probably is a story behind it. Pauline Schultz wants to know, are you still raising heirloom tomatoes?
Yes, I am. The story
The world
there
wants to know.
The story there is that I once grew 83 tomato varieties just for the hell of it. And, as one does. And my favorite variety was called Fruity Mix, which was an experimental variety developed by Tim Peters. And then I went off and started doing the AIDS ride. And of course, when you're training to ride 585 miles in 7 days, you spend all spring training. And so I couldn't raise tomatoes for many years. And then I came back and I decided that I wanted to look for Fruity Mix again, and I couldn't find it. And it turned out that Tim Peters had gone out of business and it had dropped off the face of the earth. And finally, I was having lunch with my ex's new wife, and she said, "Oh, I have over 100 varieties of tomato seed. If you want some, you can have them, but I don't know how we got them." I said, "You have my tomato seeds." And I'd given him all my tomato seeds when I went off to do the AIDS ride and when I went off to Southeast Asia. And so he had these old Fruity Mix seeds, and they had somehow gotten crossed with some other kind of tomato. And so I'm working on breeding them back to the original variety. And meanwhile, I've given seeds to all the seed breeders that I could find so that it wouldn't get lost again. So that's the story behind those.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's so Tien-like. It's a great story.
It's my other side hobby.
There you go. Linda Hardison wants to know, what percentage of your time is spent on designing and sampling for your weaving project? Great question. Thank you, Linda.
90%. Only 10% of it is actually spent weaving the final product.
Do you sample like on a smaller loom before you get on your big loom, or is it all computer drawn out first?
So I spend about I would say I spend about 50% of the time doing drawings and sketches in Photoshop, and then I weave samples, and then I go back and I on the big loom, and then I go back and do more sketches, and then I go back and weave more samples, and it's an iterative process. Only at the very end do I weave the actual thing.
I know somebody's going to ask, what do you sample on? Do you sample on the shack?
No, I sample on the Jacquard loom. I'll put on
Oh,
like a 20-yard warp,
oh, okay, okay.
and then, I weave the samples because you can't really sample. You can't sample a Jacquard thing on another
Oh,
loom.
yeah, good point. I didn't even think of that. Yeah. Um, sorry, my questions are disappearing here. Do you think you would grow your own dye garden someday?
I don't really work much with natural dyes. I find that synthetic dyes give me more reproducible results. And so the answer is no. I generally prefer to work with things that give me precise control over the results that I get.
Deborah Adamzinski. I pronounced your name really badly, Deborah. I apologize. But she says, do you ever sleep?
I sleep 8 hours a night, or actually 7.5
You do
hours a
get a
night.
lot done. You do get
I
a lot
just
done.
I'm just busy the entire rest of the time.
Well, something else I wanted to ask earlier about is you do a wonderful job marketing yourself and getting the word out about your classes and your products and that sort of thing. If somebody was just getting started as an artist, what advice would you give them about getting their name out there and learning how to market themselves?
So, if you're planning on selling your work, then there are kind of two separate answers. If you're planning to sell your work, then your challenge is going to be that you're really selling a story, because your work, having quality work is not enough, especially in a day when craft shows are on the decline. You pretty much need to be able to sell online. The I make a point of talking to artists when I go to craft shows, and they've all pretty much said the same thing, which is that even at the American Craft Council show, which is sort of the granddaddy show, foot traffic is on the decline, the craft show is on the decline, and the reason is that the people are buying online. So if you go online and you're going onto Etsy or something like that, now you're competing with 1,000 other artists, and a lot of them are people who aren't doing it professionally and are just trying to make back the money that they spend on materials. And so it's really tough. And so what you need to be able to do is develop a following. And so what they're buying really is a relationship with you and your story. So so you need to draw people in, and that means writing either to your mailing list or to your blog, and telling them about what's going on in your studio and telling them about your work, and not necessarily telling them about what your dog ate for breakfast, but engaging them. I have a friend who did actually make a living as a production weaver, and he was selling as the weaving monk. And so he was spinning a story about himself as sort of this isolated weaver in a forest, uh doing his weaving in a yurt off the grid. And so what people were buying from him wasn't just, a poncho or a ruana, but this vision of a poncho or a ruana that was woven by somebody who was, living off the grid in this isolated, peaceful place. And so you need to have some sort of twist on it, and you need to develop a relationship with the people who are buying from you if you don't have that foot traffic.
That's a good point. That whole relationship of,
Mhm.
that's a great point. Thank you. Victoria Zakanowitz. I'm terrible with these names. She said, if you find yourself falling down rabbit holes with constant research, what fills that curiosity now? So what's your next rabbit hole, or what rabbit hole are you in now?
The rabbit hole I'm in right now actually is actually my teaching business, because there's so much to learn. I have been studying things like, I've been studying things like marketing and just running a small business and how to hire people and all those other things, and so that's my current rabbit hole. But, I just got back from my first 2-week vacation in literally years. I mean, I haven't taken a vacation in something like 4 years, and so I just got back from a 2-week vacation. I was like, "Hey, this, like, weaving thing stuff is actually, like, fun." And so I think my next rabbit hole is going to be, uh, coming up with ways, creating my own weaving workstation at home and reconnecting myself to actually weaving for fun as opposed to weaving for classes. I'm actually working on this wonderful warp right now, which is all the colors of fire. I painted it with orange and red and yellow, and it is done with, unmercerized it's done with mercerized cotton, silk cord, and, silk, like 60s 2 silk, and it's 3 different sizes of fiber, and they all took the dye slightly different, uh, and it's just going to be glorious. So I'm doing 1 layer of that and 1 layer of black in double weave on one of my TC2s, and I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, and that's just going to be awesome. I've got 16 yards of it. I'm putting it on the loom, and then I'll figure out what to do with it. But with 16 yards, I could have a lot of fun. I can't wait.
Well, I'm completely feeling like a slacker. Um, you're amazing, Tien, the things you get done. And I'm so excited that you came on the show today. This has just been too much fun. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us that you have today.
Thank you for having me on. This has been hilarious and
Oh,
fun.
good. Oh, good. Um, if you want to learn more about Tien, and do go to her website. For one thing, she's incredibly generous with her knowledge. She was telling you that the recipes for the dyes are on there. There's all kinds of things on her website. So be sure you go to her website. There's information about her classes if you want to sign up for her next class. Her blog's on there, and you can see more of her work. And all of that is on warpandweave.com. I want to thank our sponsors today, Marcy Petrini and Terry Dwyer. Thank you, Marcy and Terry, for supporting Textiles and Tea. We do appreciate it. If your guild or you or your business would like to sponsor Textiles and Tea, please get more information from our website at weavespindye.org. Textiles and Tea is supported by the generous donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, please support HTA by becoming a member or donating, or both, at weavespindye.org. If you missed part of the show, if you want to hear this again, which I can understand why you will, or you want to share it with someone, Textiles and Tea is recorded, all of them, if you want to see past episodes also, and it's on Facebook, the HTA Facebook page. You can go there and see all the Textiles and Tea episodes. You do not have to have a Facebook account. Facebook will try to get you to do that, but you don't have to have a Facebook account to watch the episodes. Next week, I am very excited that we are going to have dyer and fiber artist Gene Shepard, and he's going to be on here next week. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful week, and happy tea.